Me mateys, did you know that pirates were in fact pretty fucking racist and sexist? Or at least the movies are. Well, good thing I'm here to tell you all about it. Arr. Welcome back everybody to me doing Pirate Winter, and this is number 3 of a series of videos about pirate stories that I'm going to tell you while I still have not all of my teeth. So let's get started, and today we'll be talking about The Pyrates by George MacDonald Fraser, published in 1983, and I'll give you a quick rundown of what it is, and then we'll go into the usual detail of what we can learn from this specific book. And before we do all of that, I will give a personal cheers to another channel member, and this time it is the Honourable Demidrek Hayward. This one's for you. Cheers, my friend. If you want one of those personalized cheers, well, you can join the Patreon, or you can join the channel. I would certainly appreciate it, but you don't have to. And now, let's talk about The Pyrates. So, as I said before, The Pyrates was written or published in 1983 by George MacDonald Fraser. It is a story about pirates, but it's also a comedic story about pirates that does take a lot of inspiration from pirate movies, pirate stories from the pulp era, that kind of stuff, and lampoons them through parody, through all of these things. It does have a plot. It's a very convoluted one. It does have a lot of jokes that you will probably enjoy, or maybe not enjoy, if you have seen a lot of old-timey pirate movies, a lot of swashbuckling things, like, say, the Errol Flynn movies, that kind of stuff. If you've read a Captain Blood by Raphael Sabatini, that kind of stuff. In that case, you will enjoy this. If you have never seen any of those old movies or read any of these old books, this may be a bit of a hard sell to you. I think it's a very, very important and interesting book if you want to learn about pirate stories, but it does have, you know, these kind of problems. It is very long, and that doesn't necessarily work well with being very funny. And before we move on, once again, I think you should read this if you're interested in pirate stories in general, and but be aware, it also is, well, over 40 years old, and that comes with language issues. It does talk about a lot of issues with pirate movies and pirate stories from the, well, 1950s, 1940s, and so forth, which were pretty racist and pretty sexist. And it does use language that was from that time to exaggerate and, you know, all of that. But if you are sensitive to racist or sexist slurs in any way, shape, or form, there's a bunch of pretty hefty ones that I would not say in public, and I would not say on YouTube, even less, you know, in there. So just be aware of that. Beyond that, I think it's a really funny book and a really informative one at the same time, if you have that background in pirate stories. So yeah, go read it if you haven't, and this applies to you. And now, let's talk about, you know, the other stuff, and the details, and the spoilers, and all of that. Alright. Before we move any further, let's talk about what this is and who George MacDonald Fraser was. George MacDonald Fraser was a historical fiction author, also was a soldier during World War II, wrote some autobiographical stuff about that. He's probably best known in book circles for the Flashman series. It's a series of novels about a soldier in the 19th century in Victorian England doing a lot of terrible things. He's actually, you know, a character taken from Tom Jones' School Days. He's a minor character there. Flashman is a bully. He's a misogynist. He's a racist. He's a terrible person. These are written from his first-person perspective, and they do pretty effectively, I would argue, deconstruct a lot of, like, British national myths around, you know, Victorian military and all of that stuff. That's probably where you may know him from. So he's very much someone who knows about history and shit. We'll get back to that. He also, and this is important for this specific book, was a screenwriter for a lot of interesting screenplays. He wrote screenplays for a Three Musketeers adaptation from the 1960s, and he was one of the screenwriters on the script for the James Bond movie Octopussy. So, yeah. Tentacles seem to be his thing, I guess. No, seriously, he worked in Hollywood and he worked as a writer, so a book like The Pyrates is something where the lampooning of pirate movies is coming from a place of at least some experience when it comes to Hollywood in the 50s and 60s and 70s, right? So that's out of the way. Now let's talk about where this is going. And we need to go back to the idea that pirate stories, or well, Golden Age piracy at least, is one of what I would call modern day myths in a lot of ways. That means that from the beginning it was heavily narrativized, and it was always used to talk about issues in the time when a certain piece of pirate fiction, pirate history, whatever, was written. We talked about this before, right? So you have a lot of stuff about well, discipline or lack thereof in in the military, and pirates wanting to escape that, and the idea of being press ganged and that stuff in like the early days. And then it's very much about poverty and breaking the law to well, equalize that, and class differences and so forth. That's something you can find in pirate stories. You find the fascination with buried treasure in 19th century pirate stories, and so on and so on and so on. So that's something that has always been there, and we need to be aware of that, because when it comes to pirate movies and pirate stories, they once again showed up in the 1930s and 1940s and 1950s, and this is the era that the Pyrates is mostly talking about. Now, when we talk about pulp fiction, whether it's movies or stories, there's a lot of stuff in there that is once again tied to the time and place and mode of production, the target audience, all of that. So it is very much, on the one hand, about individual men doing very manly things, fighting a lot, rescuing damsels in distress. All of the cliches that you know from adventure stories are basically packed into that. But that's only one part of what happened in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and that is replicated in a lot of these pirate stories, or that's sort of impacts the way pirate stories were told at the time. And that is, of course, it is on the one hand the ascendancy or the decline of the British Empire and the ascendancy of the American Empire in a lot of ways. And as I've spoken about when we come to Arthurian fiction, for example, which is another myth that has been used to tell stories about national identity and so forth, right? The British Empire in particular, in decline, was telling a lot of stories about well, British manliness and so forth, sometimes to claim that this is what Britain needs to return to keep its empire, sometimes, just trying to find examples of what not to do and so forth. So that's something that is there. Glorifying the past and so forth is a key element in that. And America in the 1930s, 40s, 50s and so forth was, well, taking over world power in a lot of ways, or the hegemony of the North Atlantic world, for example, mostly as sort of the more or less self-styled legitimate heir to Britain. So while being different from Britain and having, lived as, the people that fought Britain to become independent and so forth, at that point in time, it's once again back to emphasizing the connection to Britain, which leads to the kind of world that is portrayed in a lot of these pirate stories. Obviously, a lot of them are set before, the independence of the United States, so there's only British people in those stories anyway, and that's something we find in these books. And that leads to some very interesting forms of, also racism. So that's something we need to be aware of here. The next part that I think is important to mention is that as this book was published in 1983 and takes a stab at this older form of pirate movies, in a lot of ways it does sort of end that era of golden age of Hollywood movies about pirates and so forth. It took a long time until pirate movies came back, and that was obviously with the Pirates of the Caribbean in the early 2000s. So this is already talking about a almost a past art form in a lot of ways. So that's something to be aware of here. The next part is, of course, once again, history. And while this book is more focusing on the film language, and we'll get there in a moment, it is still written by someone who is very well researched and versed in historical detail, in historical literature in particular. Fraser also wrote, obviously, serious historical fiction. Black Ajax is one that I still want to read, about a black boxer in Edwardian or Victorian England, for example. This kind of stuff, right? And we see this a lot, because what he does throughout the book is contrast what everyone knows as pirate tropes and so forth, contrast them in mentions, sly asides and so forth with historical facts, which already starts in the beginning when he talks about the idea of England, the merry old England, with all the cliches that you have in like romantic depictions of, romanticized depictions of early modern England, right? And then he talks about how that is not the historical fact. And it's like, this is a story about, you know, the kind of England that everyone wants to have at the time. And then he cites authors. He makes references to someone like Samuel Pepys. And if you have never read The Diary of Samuel Pepys, you should do that, because it's a real thing, and it exists, and it's really interesting if you're into 17th century English history. He does a lot of these sort of like connections there. We'll get back to how he uses that to good effect throughout the book. So that's certainly something we find in this book, and I wanted to bring that up before we move further. Now let's talk about film language and films. See, this book is written as a story that constantly reminds us that it is more metafictional. It is more about pirate stories as told in fantasy. And we see that a lot. We have characters basically break out of character and talk about that they can't be murdered on page 160 because clearly they are the main character of the movie, of the story, so that can't happen. We have stuff like that. We have the narrator, the main narrator, address us, the reader, breaking the fourth wall in that regard. We have a lot of that. So it does deliberately play with the language of film. And in this case, a very specific language of film, because film language also changes over time. And that's something we see a lot. We have like one interesting chapter here in the beginning where the ship is sailing, and it describes how to visualize that. It's like, visualize it how directors have always visualized it. You see the map, and then you see the ship, and then you see shots of individual characters on the ship doing specific things that tell the audience where this is going at the moment. We have stuff like that, and that's very deliberately metafictional, trying to use the written word to do cinematic things, or wrestle with the medium of cinema. Something that Terry Pratchett, for example, also does fairly well in a couple of novels, most famously, obviously, in Moving Pictures. So this reads very British in that regard. There are other parallels to Terry Pratchett, I would argue, with this specific book, and of course to Douglas Adams, and one final one that is really obvious, and we'll get there in a second further, is obviously Monty Python, and the historical Monty Python stuff like Life of Brian and The Holy Grail, of course, in particular. So this is something to be aware of. It tries to wrestle with the filmic language. Now let's move on to the next part, and that is comedy and parody. I already mentioned this is a comedic novel, and what's important about comedic novels is you need to find a way to do humor. George MacDonald Fraser chooses parody. Now the thing is, if you want to parody a medium, you need to understand the medium, you need to, ideally, I would argue, love the medium, and I think that is something that George MacDonald Fraser certainly does. He's certainly watched enough pirate movies and read enough pirate stories to get his references, to get his jokes in and all of that, and that's good. The problem with parody is that what parody often does is it exaggerates elements that are already in a specific medium, in a specific genre, in a specific form, right? You take the idiosyncrasies of said medium and you exaggerate them so everyone gets the joke, basically. And that's fine, and that's just, how the medium works. But there is a problem. If part of what you're doing with your specific story is also look at the problematic aspects of said form or said media form, right? Then what you need to do is obviously also exaggerate them. And this brings me to the large issue with this, and I already mentioned this. There is racism in this book, and there's sexism in this book. So why is this a problem? See, George MacDonald Fraser is clearly aware of the fact that these that pirate movies are racist, and we'll dismantle it in a second. And the way he chooses to deal with that is by exaggerating the racism so that even the last person at the back of the class will understand that this is clearly racist and clearly sexist and so forth. The problem with that is a way of doing criticism that you can only do from a place of privilege. George MacDonald Fraser, obviously famously being British and Scottish in fact, right, can use, or does use at this point, racist slurs to show out, to explain how racist, pirate movies are, pirate stories are, and so forth. And in his, in his defense, I would argue he's racist against everyone, right? There's racism against black people, there's racism against different people from different parts of Asia, there's racism against Spanish people, there's racism against Irish people in here. It's fucking racist all the way down, is what I'm saying. But, once again, this only works if you are not one of these people, because if you are a black person, for example, and you constantly read racist slurs in this book, this rings differently, right? And that's one of those problems. The same obviously goes with sexism. A lot of pirate stories are obviously very sexist. You have damsels in distress, and we talked about this, and the other version is, of course, you have the incredibly bad girl, Anne Bonny, for example, we spoke about in On Stranger Tides, right? And Bonny shows up in this one as well, right? And she's much better developed as a character in this comedy story than she was in On Stranger Tides. But it once again leads to the fact that there's a lot of sexism in here that yes, is egregious. But as a dude, I can read this and go like, well, this is absolutely egregious. As a woman, I suspect this would hit differently because it describes something that you already suffer through, right? And this is something where I think we need to be aware of the sort of like limits of parody to sort of criticize and dismantle certain problematic aspects of society and so forth, because it can be very, very uncomfortable if you are doing this from a perspective of privilege, right? And this is something that this book certainly struggles with. The other part is, of course, the intensity, and that's also like an issue with comedy, right? Comedy is funny, but comedy shouldn't be too long. When I said Monty Python, I really mean this has a lot of parallels with those Monty Python movies. One problem is, of course, that Monty Python novels, as you may be aware of, right, do in fact, Monty Python movies do in fact do a lot of slapstick comedy. Now, slapstick comedy is kind of hard to translate into, and visual humor is kind of hard to translate into writing, because you need to write out everything. You know how they say that an image says more than 1,000 words? Well, it's not always true, but there's certainly something there, right? And that's exactly what you can see here. This book is fairly long. It's like 500 something pages. And the constant jokes and the visual jokes that are then written out, so you have to imagine them and so forth, they lead to an intensity that is, imagine if like Monty Python and the Holy Grail would be like a 3-hour movie and not just like a 2-hour movie, right? It's that level. So at some point it becomes exhausting, because there's still another thing that needs to be lampooned. There's still another element of pirate stories that needs to be taken care of. And I already complained about how the plot in On Stranger Tides, because it needs to sort of adhere to pirate form, is convoluted in a lot of ways. This one's even more so, and once again you can see that as an exaggeration of very convoluted pirate plots and go, well, yeah, sure, that's clearly the joke here. It's still an exhausting joke, is what I'm saying. And that's certainly something that we see here. Now, let's move forward and talk about the elements that I just mentioned and how they are important, in fact, because while uncomfortable and coming from a place of privilege, that doesn't mean that, the criticism of pirate stories as racist, as sexist and so forth isn't, correct, because it is. And in particular, the idea of the Spanish being basically the bad guys in this book, I think, is really important, because pirate stories, being stories about imperialism, as we also mentioned before, right, need to find an empire to fight. And if you are, obviously, the British, or if you are the American, you basically come from a place of hegemony in a lot of ways. You need to find ways to demonize a different empire, while also explaining why you being the hegemon is in fact a good thing. And George MacDonald Fraser does very much pinpoint to the fact that in a lot of pirate stories, and it's always the Spanish that are the bad guys. Partly that is historically because at the time of the golden age of piracy, obviously pirates were, English pirates at least, Anglo-American pirates were very much fighting the Spanish Empire, being one of the big empires, as being very much the wrestling away of the Spanish hegemony by the British, right? So we see that, and it makes sense. But what we also see is that while rehearsing that basically and repeating that in the 20th century, people went back to those Spanish racist stereotypes of everyone being exaggerated. It's where, jokes around the Spanish Inquisition come in, and everyone being bloodthirsty to the max, which, yeah, don't get me wrong, the Spanish Inquisition is pretty fucking bloodthirsty. But so is everything the British did afterwards, and so is a lot of things that the Americans did. Maybe they didn't use, medieval torture instruments, but they sure do torture. And so looking at pirate stories as something told back then, to tell stories about societal issues and questions of empire, fighting empire, and so forth, is something that comes back here in those media. And the thing is, of course, that media should do better and maybe not repeat and reinforce certain racist, sexist, and so forth stereotypes in the service of empire. But then again, since it's an industry, it's kind of beholden to those, the powers that be. So that's where a lot of the racism comes in. The casual racism against Irish people, I think, is an interesting one, because that's also something that you see in the depiction of Irish people in movies all over the place. And making it more explicit, I think, does help a lot of people to recognize that racism against Irish people in a way that people in the 1980s were not necessarily aware of. So having that in there, and just like having casual situations where, everyone there looks terrible and so forth. Also, it looks like Asian stereotypes, because that's just like all the people you get in Golden Age piracy, as depicted by the movies, basically, is the unsaid part there. This is really helpful, because it allows you to watch these movies and watch other movies from the time of this making, right, from the 1930s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and recognize all of these issues. The same with the sexism, right? And we have a lot of stuff going on here about how, for example, and how those things intersect. Once again, this is not bad. The way that Sheba, the black piratess, is sexualized in a very different way than Vanity, the white damsel in distress, and the way that, once again, that Maliflua, the Spanish girl, is once again sexualized. It showcases very much how these different stereotypes, gender stereotypes, were also racial stereotypes, and how those things intersect, and that's pretty cool. That's really, really well done. It's also very uncomfortable, because he uses very painful language there, but I think it's important to understand that, and it's certainly something that in the year 2025, 5 years ago, I would say we don't need a book like this anymore, because we've realized it. We've heard about the Bechdel test. We kind of know that old movies are sexist and racist. But when you look at the world right now, maybe we still need that kind of book, right? So that's an interesting thing here. Another part is, of course, how movies do retell stories and twist histories, and that's something that we see in here as well. See, one of the things that we know about pirates, and that everyone knows about pirates, is like how they, how they were sort of democratic, right? They had councils, they pass. And it's a narrative what we have all the way from a general history of the pirates, all the way back where already we hear about the rules that pirates had to subscribe to, and then we see that with the black spot and all of that stuff in Treasure Island. We see it on Stranger Tides. It's always been there, but we don't know how much of that is actually true, and it's certainly been overemphasized, especially when you talk about British, who are kind of weirdly straddling that line between being proud royalists and also proudly democratic in a lot of ways. It's even more emphasized with Americans. Like, that's one way of identifying pirates with you. It's like, well, they're not British because clearly they're not for the king. They actually have democracy like we do, or pretend to, right? So that's interesting. And what I love about it is the way that Fraser takes this by having the Welsh pirate always coming out and being basically like a leftist labor unionizer, reading all the different sort of complaints that you have about job safety and all of these things, which once again we know that there were rules according to Charles Johnson, the fictitious Charles Johnson and General History of the Pirates. We know that there were rules about damages paid if you lose a limb or something else if you get wounded as a pirate. We know these things existed, but you can obviously exaggerate that. And through that, once again, also show up how pirate movies do very much exaggerate these kind of things, which, once again, leads to that whole idea of how pirate movies or pirate mythology does express the concerns of a specific place and time. All of this is really, really good. And once again, what is interesting and why I think this book succeeds in a lot of ways, if you can stomach, the privilege and shit like that, right, is how through tying back the historical elements into this, Fraser is able to sort of like showcase that difference between the myth and the few facts that we really have. One interesting thing, for example, is our main character, Captain Ben Avery. Now, Ben Avery is an interesting character in that, that Captain Henry Avery is a historical pirate, actually one that was really successful. He boarded a fleet of people traveling from India to on a Hajj to Mecca, and took the daughter of the Mughal prisoner. We know that because the Mughal of India at the time did in fact charge Britain with, damages and all of that. We know all of this existed. We also know that Captain Henry Avery had the nickname Long Ben. So suddenly we have Ben Avery in here. So he's a real character, but immediately got turned into a media sensation. There are broadsheets about him joining, asking people to join him on the high seas, do the treasure thing, all of that. So we have these things, and by Ben Avery being the most annoying depiction of British Anglo-Saxon manhood in a lot of ways, and being disciplined, and while still being a pirate, but also being an officer, and all of these things that all don't make any fucking sense at all. We can see with a historic example of a pirate that got turned into a mythology at the time, how this is done once again and again and again by pirate stories and pirate films over the ages. And I think that's brilliant in the way that, once again, George MacDonald Fraser does all of this. The problem is, of course, and this is kind of where I want to end this for today, that, as I said, this is written in 1983. At that point, pirate movies were pretty much dead. The big adventure movies were a thing of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And historic concerns, or at the time, societal concerns, at sort of like the dawn of the Reagan age, right, had shifted to some place where pirates and the golden age of piracy didn't necessarily work anymore. And this makes the whole book feel somewhat dated. And a lot of the stuff criticized about the language of film, the language of pirate mythology, doesn't apply to how we do movies anymore, because movie making obviously changed a lot in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so forth. So the question is, how do changes in the depiction of pirates and the depictions of piracy in the media from the 2000s onward, how do they change our image of our understanding of piracy, and how do the visual images, the language of film in this case, of Pirates of the Caribbean, how do they then influence the way stories about pirates are written when they come in book form, and what concerns of the 21st century are now negotiated through the medium of pirate stories. And that's something that I'll talk to you about, hopefully, if I don't get my teeth fixed until then, in the next video when we talk about the adventures of Amina al-Sirafi. So that's my thoughts on The Pyrates by George MacDonald Fraser. Once again, it's a book you can do a lot with. I would like to hear your thoughts on it if you have read the book. If you plan to read the book, let me know in the comments. If you have other thoughts about pirates, let me know in the comments. I'm always willing to read those. If you don't have anything else to say, I don't know, do something. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, share the video, do all of those things. Join the channel if you want a personalized shout out, or join the Patreon if you want to do that. It would be wonderful. I will return to something else now, and I'll talk to you very soon. And until then, thanks, and, well, cheers, I guess.